Colleagues, I rise today to say a few words on Bill C-16, an act for granting to Her Majesty certain sums of money for the federal public administration for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2023. This bill provides funding for what is known as interim supply, which gives the government spending authority prior to the approval of the main estimates.
The publication, the House of Commons Procedure and Practice by Marleau and Montpetit, explains it this way. Since the fiscal year begins on April 1st, and the normal supply cycle only provides for the House to decide on main estimates in June, the government would appear to be without funds for the interim 3 months. For this reason, the House authorizes an advance on the funds requested in the main estimates to cover the needs of public service from the start of the fiscal year to the date on which Appropriation Act based on the main estimates of that year is passed. It does feel like party time when it comes to spending funds around here. Colleagues, as someone who came to this place with a fairly extensive background in the private sector, I can assure you that this process raises flags for me, and it should for all of you. We are being asked to provide approval for the government to spend about 1/4 of its voted expenditure plan prior to a detailed examination of those expenditures and prior to the approval of the main estimates, which won't happen until sometime in June. Furthermore, it is important to realize that regardless of what Parliament decides about the main estimates in June, any spending approval which is granted through this interim supply bill cannot be withdrawn later, as stated in the House of Commons Procedure and Practice. During the examination of the main estimates, neither the House or its committees can reduce a vote to any amount less than the amount already granted in interim supply. This applies to the Senate as well, colleagues. Even though the Senate's National Finance Committee has not yet cracked open a single page of the main estimates, this chamber is required to approve $75 billion of interim spending, and there's no recourse to withdraw any of that spending approval once it has been granted. If the business of supply were operating properly, this would be an acceptable process. Checks and balances would be in place to ensure that adequate accountability and oversight was in place. But this is not the case. When it comes to the business of supply, parliamentarians are receiving inadequate information, receiving it late, and are not being provided with a plan to see this rectified. We always complain about it, but it's the same ugly cycle. I want to be clear, colleagues. This is not a new problem. It has occurred many, many times. We rip our shirts in indignation when it occurs. Le directeur parlementaire du budget avait soulevé ces problèmes dans son rapport paru en novembre, intitulé « Points à considérer par le Parlement sur la réforme des travaux de subsidies ».
He noted that many parliamentarians had, and I quote, increasing unease about their ability to provide informed consent to the government's fiscal plans, end of quote. It also states, and I quote, the most tangible illustration of this is all those reports where, since the mid-1990s, the standing committees of Parliament have been recommending improved controls as part of the work of supply. The mid-1990s, that was 30 years ago, and the problem persists.
Colleagues, I think I can safely speak for most of us when I say that when the main estimates arrive, you open them up to take a look and almost immediately feel overwhelmed and exhausted, as stated by many of our colleagues. No doubt there are a couple of exceptions, of course, to this, perhaps Senator Marshall and Senator Lafreda, but I'm sure that for a great many of us, perusing the main estimates can be like drinking from a fire hose. There is simply no way we can be expected to adequately review and digest that amount of financial information in the time frame that's expected. In the end, I wonder how many of us slap the estimate shut and are more thankful than ever for Senators Marshall and Lafreda and others who more readily consume all that information and are able to drill down on it because, colleagues, it represents an awful lot of money that is going out the door in an awfully quick fashion. But the truth is, no parliamentarian has the ability to properly scrutinize the government's expenditure plan and main estimates because the information necessary to do so is not made readily available. And my raising the red flag on this isn't just partisan rhetoric. This is a widely acknowledged problem which has been left unaddressed for a long time. In his 2016 report, 6 years ago, the Parliamentary Budget Officer noted that there were three core problems with the business of supply. One, the budget presents new policy initiatives, but the estimates present functional adjustments to the allotments. Why does this even matter? Well, because, and I quote, Parliament does not have control over new policy initiatives, allowing money to be transferred between policy initiatives without parliamentary approval. End of quote. Second problem is that the main estimates do not include new budget measures. This means that, and I quote, Parliament spends its time scrutinizing and spending a plan in the main estimates that does not reflect the current reality presented in the budget. End of quote. Thirdly, the budget and main estimates have a different scope and basis of accounting, as noted by the PBO. This means that the Parliament is asked to vote on spending plan in the main estimates that cannot be easily reconciled with overall spending. Collègues, j'ai mentionné ces trois.
Colleagues, I mention these 3 points to emphasize that the problems that affect the ability of parliamentarians to adequately perform their oversight function of public spending are well known. There is no mystery to this. In fact, the 2016 report of the Parliamentary Budget Officer summarized the findings of a 2012 House of Commons committee report, colleagues, entitled Strengthen Parliamentary Scrutiny of the Estimates. That report, which earned all-party support, not only named the problems, but proposed practical and meaningful measures to address them. That was 10 years ago, and parliamentarians are still waiting for solutions to be implemented.
To its credit, this government did not simply ignore the proposals. It admitted the system is broken and that it needed to be fixed. In November 2016, again, 6 years ago, the government published a document entitled Empowering Parliamentarians Through Better Information, the government's vision for estimates reform. The very first page in the document, which is available online, reads as follows. The inability of Parliament to play a meaningful role in reviewing the government spending plans is a frequent source of frustration. It stems from an incoherent estimates process where budget items are not included in the main estimates. Spending plans are difficult to understand and reconcile, and departmental reports are neither meaningful nor informative. End of quote. Those colleagues were the government's own words in 2016. That statement was made in a document published by the President of the Treasury Board at the time, none other than the Honourable Scott Bryson. Now, on the one hand, perhaps we can take some comfort in the fact that the government has acknowledged there is a problem and that it needs to be addressed. But on the other hand, that acknowledgement was made 5.5 years ago, and nothing was substantively changed since then. Absolutely nothing.
In this year's report on the main estimates, the Parliamentary Budget Officer again sounded the alarm. He wrote, and I quote, as the Parliamentary Budget Officers have noted in previous reports, the main estimates must be tabled by a set date, by March 1st at the latest. But other related information, including departmental plans and departmental results reports, are not subject to such a requirement. This discretionary authority provides significant flexibility to the government. However, it creates a risk of a disconnect between the amounts parliamentarians are asked to approve and the timing of the details of planned and actual spending. This undermines the ability of parliamentarians to conduct meaningful scrutiny of proposed expenditures.
There's more. The PBO went on to say, while the government refers to the main estimates as the government's expenditure plan, they generally fail to include any measures in the corresponding budget, nor do the departmental plans, and therefore present an incomplete picture of the government spending. Tabling the main estimates prior to the release of the budget has allowed for more detailed Treasury Board scrutiny of budget measures prior to their consideration by Parliament in the supplementary estimates. However, This results in asking parliamentarians to approve funding through the main estimates that were incomplete, as they do not represent an accurate picture of government's planned spending. The PBO goes on, and I quote him, as previously admitted by the government, this lack of cohesion between two of the government's primary fiscal documents engenders confusion. As such, it hinders the ability of parliamentarians and Canadians to understand the overall federal spending strategy, track new policy measures announced in the budget, or identify the expected results of a new budget measure. The PBO then repeats the three all-party recommendations made 10 years earlier by the House of Commons Government Operations Committee. 1. Parliament should establish a fixed tabling date for the budget. 2. This tabling date should be early enough to ensure that budget measures can be incorporated in the main estimates. 3. The departmental plan should be tabled at the same time as the main estimates. In addition, the PBO repeated two recommendations it made earlier this year. 1. The government should move the publication date of the public accounts to no later than September 30th. 2. The government should require the departmental results reports to be published at the same time. According to the PBO, these 5 changes would, and I quote, create a cohesive, intuitive, and critically transparent financial decision-making process for legislators. Colleagues, the truth of the matter is that not only are the problems well known, but the solutions are equally well known, and that the government's clear acknowledgement that these problems exist quite a while ago and need to be addressed. You would think that this equates to a clear and simple path forward. And yet, not only has nothing been done, but this lack of information and accountability has progressively been getting worse over the tenure of this government. Consider the fact that in 2020, we never even received a budget. And then in 2021, the budget didn't arrive until the third week of April. Of course, the government blamed the lost budget in 2020 on COVID, and the late budget in 2021 on COVID. And yet, even this year, the budget will not be tabled in Parliament until April 7th. The Financial Administration Act requires that the public accounts be tabled in Parliament before December 31st of each year. But by convention, they are usually tabled in October. Last year, they were not tabled until November 30th. The year before that, it was tabled December the 12th. This year, the public accounts were not tabled until December the 14th, 2021, which, as the Parliamentary Budget Officer pointed out, was the last publication date since 1993-94. Dans son rapport publié en janvier.
In its January report, Economic and Fiscal Update 2021, Issues for Parliamentarians, the Parliamentary Budget Officer noted, and I quote, by comparison, Canada was one of the last G7 countries to publish its final accounts for the 2020-2021 fiscal year. He adds, federal public accounts are published later than most provincial and territorial public accounts, and nearly half the provinces and territories publish their respective public accounts within 6 months. End of quote. The government's late publication of departmental performance reports illustrates this same failure to provide timely information.
Reports outline the government's actual performance by department for the most recent fiscal year and enable parliamentarians to review what was actually accomplished through all that money being spent. And yet this year, these reports were not published until February 2022, which was 10 months after the end of the fiscal year. This is no small thing. As noted by the PBO, the lack of timely, comprehensive result data makes scrutinizing proposed spending more difficult. It is important that parliamentarians can understand the result organizations expect to achieve, how they will be measured, and how these compare to previous years in order to make informed decisions. End of quote. Colleagues, there's no lack of clear action that the government could be taking in order to correct the problems which plague our ability to provide proper oversight and accountability to the expenditures of public funds, which is our fundamental role in this place. And yet, instead of doing so, they continue to make things worse instead of better. A perfect example of this is found in the interim supply bill before us today. As I mentioned earlier, interim supply is supposed to provide an advanced appropriation of money needed for April, for May, and June, 3 months, colleagues. Yet, under this government, the amount of money included in the interim supply bill has sharply increased since they took power from 29% to more than 40% of total voted appropriations in the main estimates. How high do they plan on allowing that number to go? It's like they're stuffing as much spending as they can into an interim estimate just to diminish accountability even further. 29 to 40%. It's unacceptable. Colleagues, we desperately need this government to get its act together and to do the right thing. But all the indicators are pointing to the wrong direction. Spending is going up, while accountability is going down. Disregard for the role of Parliament has become what we all know it to be. Even those that deny it sense it and see it. Take note that this interim supply bill is for $75.5 billion. That is almost as much as the entire voted supply in 2015-2016 main estimates when this government took power. That year, total voted appropriations in the main estimates came to $88 billion. This year, that number is $190 billion. That is a 116% increase in only 7 years. In 2015-2016, interim supply was $29 billion. This year, it is 193% higher at $75.5 billion. This government has almost doubled their voted spending requirements in only 7 years. Et n'oubliez pas.
And don't forget, colleagues, that the main estimates don't take into account any new spending that the government will announce in its budget, nor do they take into account all the spending promises that had to be made to the NDP in order to buy their support to save the government. We have a government that doesn't care about opening the floodgates to government spending and then printing as much money as necessary to keep sprinkling money around.
They don't care that our debt is ballooning. They don't care that the inflation rate has exploded. They don't care that last year's fiscal sustainability report warned that current fiscal policy in Canada is not now sustainable over the long term. And they don't care that they have no plan to balance the budget. The truth is, colleagues, they have no fiscal anchor. They are irresponsible. They're short-sighted and dangerously negligent in their stewardship of public finances, and they can't be bothered to make the fundamental changes necessary to ensure proper oversight by Parliament. But it is our obligation to make sure they do. At the end of the day, I want to remind colleagues that the way this democracy is supposed to work is not the way it's working. It's not the Prime Minister at the top with his cabinet under him and his MPs under him and his senators under him. It's supposed to be the other way around. It's supposed to be Parliament. And under Parliament, it should be ministers. And under ministers at the bottom of the totem pole, it should be the Prime Minister. That's where the word Prime Minister comes from, servant of the people. That's what ministers come from, the word servants of the people. We somewhere along the line have lost track of that reality, and we think that our Parliament, our bureaucracy, our ministers, they're all accountable to the Prime Minister's office. And it has to stop at some point if we want to defend fiscal responsibility and we want to defend democracy in the true spirit that we're supposed to be practicing it. This government has no interest in doing what is right and no qualms about heaping upon future generations all the obligations to pay for their profligated spending habits, and clearly we've seen a debt right now that generations will be saddled with for decades to come. This government has been reckless and unapologetically incompetent. Colleagues, today, I suspect, in all likelihood, that this Senate will pass this bill. We, the opposition, the Conservative Party, we will continue to call for transparency, for accountability, and for fiscal responsibility in our governance. We will redouble our efforts to ensure that after the next general election, Canadians will once again have a responsible and competent government which works to ensure the future rather than the present, and also take into consideration that decisions that we make today will have a huge impact on future generation of Canadians. Thank you.